Guess I have to unmute myself. Interesting. All right, so students, today we are moving on from Don Quixote and Faust into our littlest masterpiece, our littlest modern masterpiece, that which is Notes from the Underground. And this is when we are introduced to our great 19th century figure, Fyodor Dostoevsky. I don't have an official slide on 19th century masterpieces that could have made it into this course. There are numerous ones, and one that really fought against this one, but happens to be American, which worked against it, seen as this is partially a comparative literature, sort of world literature sort of class, was Moby Dick. But do take the four great masterpieces which follow Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky as masterpieces that also could have made it into this course, particularly Crime and Punishment and Brothers Karamazov, but also The Possessed, to some extent, because of the presence of social rationalism and social revolutionary thought in that work and its connection to the coming of communism in Russia and its spread throughout the world in the early, middle, and somewhat late 20th century. All right, well, Fyodor Dostoevsky, he was born 1821 in Moscow. He died 1821 in St. Petersburg. Sometimes the dates that are ascribed to his life are, they vary, because in the 19th century, at the time that he was alive, Russia used a different calendar from the one that we use now. So whereas I have him as born on 11 November, sometimes he's represented as having been born on 30 October. So like a 12-day difference, not a yearly difference, not something that will ever be a big issue to you, unless you happen to be a very literary trivia game. Dostoevsky is often considered a novelist and a short story writer, but really more than that, he's considered a great philosopher and psychologist. On the end of the next slide, I mentioned the underground man is often called or said to embody the philosophies of many prominent 20th century philosophies and philosophers, existentialism, Freudianism, Nietzscheanism, which comes from the 19th century. These philosophies are often ascribed to Dostoevsky, to particularly existentialism. So we talked a lot about what modernism is when we first introduced Don Quixote. We talked a lot about romanticism, neoclassicism, and their relationship to modernism and Faust. Now we talk about existentialism and its relationship to modernism and its relationship to Notes from the Underground. But the big sort of broad titular way that I would address, or marquee way I would define existentialism, is with a very pithy phrase, which is existence, I think I've said this before, precedes essence. And so if you look at your copy of Notes from the Underground, it's a wonderful Norden anthology edition, and you see on front the very famous work of two hands drawing each other by the wonderful author M.C. Escher. I think you see here a perfect visual representation of existentialism. Insofar as existence precedes essence, this means that what a human is defined by the human itself. One comes into being, one's existence comes first. And then through acting and defining, one transforms into one's essential character. It is not so much that one is born with an essence, which one must seek to embody and live out, so much as one can ascribe an essence. One can choose to identify oneself, to transform oneself, to become what one wishes to be. And so this image of two hands, of one hand drawing itself, is a perfect image. And in fact, you might think of it like this: when does one become an artist? Before one does art, while one does art, or after one has done art? And you can see that this image is an attempt at an answer. The artist becomes an artist as the artist creates art. It is in the act of doing that one becomes. So you become a teacher by teaching. You become an artist by artisting. You become an accountant by accounting. And so you become what you want to become based on doing what you want to do. And yet there are also problems with this philosophy, particularly relativism. If one can define what one wishes to become, what ought one to become? Where are transcendental values to be found in such a system? Very hard to find. Well, in any case, Dostoevsky is often called a modernist, an existentialist, a psychologist. He's, I believe, I think it is Nietzsche that says that Dostoevsky is the only psychologist worth reading for him, which is very interesting because Dostoevsky is not a professional psychologist. He was a novelist. He was an engineer. He's sometimes called a theologian, particularly when you read Brothers Karamazov and see his very, very famous story of the Grand Inquisitor, which maybe I'll have a chance to mention. And he's also sometimes considered something of a literary critic. Like I said, Dostoevsky studied engineering when he was young, became a civil servant, and while he was a civil servant, he started writing. Something interesting to note about him is that he was afflicted with a terrible disease that used to be associated with used to be considered a divine disease. It's called epilepsy, and as you know, epilepsy results in individuals sort of seeing a corona out of nowhere, experiencing feelings of bliss. And I think Dostoevsky is known to have said that he wouldn't give up his corona experiences, his experiences of bliss prior to having a seizure for anything. So they're very profound moments, as if one is being visited by an angel or by God, and then one, of course, seizes on the ground. And this is a terrible affliction that Dostoevsky had. In fact, his second wife, when she went into labor, he actually seized and went into a seizure. She later would successfully give birth to their child, but 3 months later, their child died. And Dostoevsky never forgave himself for this. He always blamed himself for the death of that child. And something to keep in mind about Dostoevsky is he is brilliant, brilliant beyond brilliant. Something I really want you to know about this writer is this is many brilliant people's favorite writer that has ever existed. Alongside Shakespeare, Goethe, Cervantes, he is apex. He is alpha prime level writer. And part of what makes people love him is he shows lower class individuals, prostitutes, like young students who are out of work, like middle-aged individuals here who are now receiving rubles from a dead relative and refuse to work. And he also shows the ugliness in the world, the decisions we make that are small, that are spiteful. He shows shame and humiliation and characters that wish to be more than they are based on European philosophy. A character Raskolnikov, for example, in Crime and Punishment, wishes to be the Overman, the Ubermensch of Nietzsche fame. And so part of being the Overman is not being subject to morality, slave morality of Christians. And so he thinks if I can rationally decide to kill an old woman, I should not feel guilt because of it, because I have rationally worked out that it is a good thing to kill her, a very utilitarian sort of argument. And yet, he will find out that there is an irrational aspect to human nature. And this is something that Dostoevsky pushes contrary to those who write at his time. The philosophers of the middle 19th century were systematizers based on Baruch Spinoza, based on G.W. Hegel, and even more contemporary thinkers like, next slide, Chernyshevsky as well. These thinkers, in a very modernist way, wished to move away from religion and superstition and to put forward ideas of modern rationalism, enlightened rationalism, to create a political order where all would use the light of their reason in order to come to the same truth. And using that same truth, they would create a world in which there was no poverty, a world in which there was no sickness, a world in which there was limited death. It actually sounds a lot like the ethos of our own modern world, where we are working so hard to limit sickness and even death to what extent we can. You should know that Dostoevsky is on the opposite side from these modernists. And instead of feeling that humans can be perfected by science and philosophy, he thinks that these are just veneers of what a human is. Yes, we can come up with these extremely sophisticated and intelligent systems of thinking, and yet at our core, we are unchanged from what we have ever been. We are irrational, we are violent, we are acquisitive. All of these aspects of us, modernism simply wishes to hide from our eyes, bury in the ground. And to some extent, you can see his connection to Freudianism, where Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis comes around at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. The repressive Victorians were in power in Western Europe, culturally speaking. And so a lot of what Sigmund Freud did was look for repressed memories or suppressed memories. But in looking for that which is repressed, one is looking for irrational desires and that which is underlying one's consciousness. Dostoevsky does a great deal for highlighting the parts of the human that exist that we wish to hide from ourselves and from others, the things that cause us shame and humiliation. He spotlights these. And so when I asked you earlier whether you liked Dostoevsky, this is part of why. Because he focuses on the worst parts of what a human is. Sort of hard to like something so consciously ugly, and yet that's part of the art of it. His characters do not make us feel warm and friendly. They're not evocative in the same way as a Disney movie where we feel like all is right by the end of the text. In fact, it's quite the opposite. By the end of reading a text by Dostoevsky, whether it be one of his great masterpieces, Crime and Punishment, Brothers K, or one of his small masterpieces like The Notes from the Underground, you should feel uncomfortable, discomfited, disoriented, as if there was a truth that was put in front of you that is destabilizing, and yet you still don't know quite what to do with it. You should feel, in a way, like there is an irritating stick in your head when you read Dostoevsky, because there's a power to his prose. There is a sophistication to his reasoning that does not admit of simple casting off. There's something that sticks with one when one reads a caliber of intellect like Dostoevsky. And it's a caliber of intellect which really, really focuses on what most of us spend most of our time trying to think that is not true about us. And so it can be very uncomfortable to read The Dark Father, Dostoevsky. After studying to be an engineer and becoming a civil servant, he dabbled in, and perhaps also during his time as a student, young radicalism and the so-called Petreshevsky circle. Petreshevsky circle. He was a left Hegelian, like Karl Marx would be, and he really wanted one social phenomenon to happen in particular. That was the freedom of the Slavs, the freedom of the serfs. He was a Slavophile, as they sometimes call, and something you know about Slav and serf. The serf was basically a slave. Slavic languages like Russian, which is Cyrillic alphabet. Slavic comes from the slave. It means slave. And so there were still, so Western Europe started to transition from feudalism to bourgeois society, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. Russia didn't start transitioning itself from a feudal economy where there are landed lords and serfs under them and into more of a city economy until the middle of the 19th century. And so the big rationalist modernist movement that those in Russia wanted, looking at their European comrades, reading their European works, reading English works by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, reading German works by Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel. These people saw them releasing their slaves, freeing their slaves in the early 19th century, and the Russians thought that they were behind. And so the educated young Russians, like Dostoevsky was at this time, wanted Russia to catch up. What was one major way that Russia could catch up with her Western European rivals? Free the serfs. Though there were problems, of course, that happened the moment the serfs were freed. For example, them being paid wages that were too low for them to justify or to cover their expenses, so they would just end up in debt to their former land or to their former lords. Even though there were problems, this was considered a major social victory for the Russians. But this is the society in which Dostoevsky, the young Dostoevsky, finds himself in, one of feeling that there's a level of primitivism around him, that they are a little bit behind, and that they need to catch up with the far more modern and revolutionized Western Europe. And to some extent, it might be like growing up in the Midwest or the South and thinking that where everything is really happening is on the West Coast or on the East Coast, either in New York or in LA. Is this true? No, but are there still people who feel like they are living where it is not happening and it is happening somewhere else, even within America? Absolutely. All right. In his text, Notes from the Underground, which is split into two parts, much like Faust, much like Don Quixote, though there was not a long period of non-writing between these two parts like there was with Faust and Don Quixote. The first part features the underground man in his 40th year, when he has already given up his job as a civil servant, and he is in the wake of the nihilism of the 1860s. The work then moves backwards. The chronology moves in a different way from what we would expect in the way that time actually moves, back to when he is in his 20s in the 1840s. And that part of the work is afflicted with the social romanticism. You see that is also the part of work where we meet the prostitute Liza, and we see something of a courting and a romance. There's a lot of ugliness and self-deception involved in this romance. Also an element of Christianity, perhaps. Keep in mind that Dostoevsky is himself an Orthodox believer, and that prostitutes are of major importance to particular Christian and Jewish stories, like Rahab the prostitute being the first character to enter into heaven after the gates of Peter are unlocked by Jesus. This is something Dante believed in. Also, Mary Magdalene herself being anecdotally a prostitute. And so relationships between protagonists and prostitutes are of major importance in Dostoevsky's work, including Crime and Punishment. Now, when he was 28 years old, Dostoevsky eventually got caught up too far in his social activities. He was arrested in the pre-dawn hours by the Tsar's political police. 9 months later, the men were brought out into the square in the middle of St. Petersburg in December. So I want you to think about this. He's been taken at night, pre-dawn hours, kept under lock and key for 9 months, and then in the middle of the night is pushed into the middle of a square to be in front of a wall covered in bullet holes. The man before him is told to go line up. And right as he lines up, Dostoevsky and the two men that are supposed to be executed with him are told that their sentences have been commuted. They knew they were going to die. They knew it. Imagine. You know how you're in line before a roller coaster and you're going to be on the next roller coaster and how you start to feel? Or you know how you walk into a class and you realize you don't have the paper that's due? You feel that? Imagine you take 3 steps this way and you're going to be shot and die. This is what he was living. And right in that moment, when the acceptance of death was sure to have been settling in, he was told that his sentence was commuted and he was going to be sent to Siberia. Which is not that much better. There are quotes of people that they'd say that they would rather be shot than sent to Siberia. But supposedly Dostoevsky's epilepsy got even worse after this, and one of the people that was sentenced alongside him, that was supposed to be executed alongside him, went crazy and never recovered because of that experience. That's how powerful his experience is. And then it's followed by 4 years of forced labor in Siberia, the coldest place on earth, and then 5 years of conscripted military service, 9 years of freedom lost by Dostoevsky. So when he writes about what's ugly, and I mean, something that he saw when he was in Siberia is he saw what he describes as the worst of humanity, like people who like to hurt children, for example, hurting children. This is something he writes about in his 1861 work, House of the Dead. I thought about including some of the details that he puts in there, but they're quite grotesque. And but you should know that this is somebody that experienced what he writes about, and that he experienced the dregs of humanity, not only himself being treated as if he were one of the dregs of humanity, but being mired among the criminals and coming to know them in a way that he otherwise would not have. This is part of what makes him special as an author. He also was not an upper class individual like Leo Tolstoy, who wrote The Great War and Peace and oh no, how's it? Anna Karenina, of course, excuse me, I was thinking of Madame Bovary, and Ivan Turgenev, who wrote Fathers and Sons. So this is a middle class perspective. Also, he was a gambling addict and had a family. And well, I'll mention that in a moment. So in any case, Dostoevsky was saved from the firing squad by a last-minute reprieve. I've seen in the literature some evidence that, in fact, part of his punishment was to be taken in front of the firing squad and then told that he had a last-minute reprieve and then taken to Siberia, which is, I think, a pretty sadistic punishment. It tells you something about 19th century Tsarist Russia. He would later be released from the labor camp in 1854, worked as a soldier on the Mongolian frontier for 5 years, and returned to Russia in 1859. Things get good now, right? Not quite. He founded a magazine called Epoch the following year and traveled to Europe for the first time. Things are finally looking up for him. But by 1864 and 1865, his first wife and his brother, with whom he had founded Epoch, and it was very close, died. His magazine folded and his debts increased. Two of Dostoevsky's pre-imprisonment works, which started to make his name before he disappeared off the map for a while and then had to return, were Poor People from 1846 and The Double, 1846. Dostoevsky was seen as a new luminary after his very first work. The problem is he disappeared for several years, just a couple of years after. He was called a new Gogol. Gogol was himself a great figure from the generation before Dostoevsky, who wrote a work called Dead Souls. It was about a character going around and buying the contracts off of dead serfs. So a very interesting sort of idea there. The Double is about a schizophrenic individual who produces a double of himself and then contrives against it. Has to deal with the fact that it wants to replace and kill him. And, you know, if you had a clone of yourself, do you think it would try and take your life? Maybe, I don't know. In any case, The House of the Dead is what he wrote immediately after his imprisonment, 1861, 1862, and all the evil that he saw there, including what I mentioned. 1864 is when Notes from the Underground come out. I think I say 1869 in the next slide, but it's 1864 because it comes out 2 years before Crime and Punishment. Right after Crime and Punishment, 1867, Dostoevsky marries his second wife, a stenographer, and flees to England to escape his debts. Now, over the next 3 years, he writes this work called The Idiot, which is about a character, Prince Mishkin, who is himself, well, it's called The Idiot, right? He's similar to Christ in that he's just constantly suggesting that people live in a very honest and inhuman way while he, with his sickly constitution, goes from drawing room to drawing room and is treated as quite a curiosity. I say all of that just to mention the history of writing this text, which is that Dostoevsky was so mired in debt. And the problem with his debts is that he would go into more debt because he was a gambling man. So he would gamble, lose the money that he had made from writing articles or from his most recent manuscript, and then he would have to do it all again. And so part of what he infuses into his writing is the feeling of having a tremendous intellect, but having profoundly weak impulse control. He's like a modern, extraordinary, liberally minded individual who has brilliant ideas, but can't act on any of them, can never begin or end anything. To some extent, the Underground Man is like that as well. But that creates a very profound consciousness to be so brilliant and ethically minded and yet incapable of acting ethically because of one's own destructive habits and impulses. In fact, Dostoevsky himself believed that it was only religion that could curb the evil and impulses in man rather than rational philosophical systems. But that's a debate that continues to rage on, by the way. Demons, sometimes called The Possessed, came out in 1872. And after this success, the couple returns to St. Petersburg, and the Brothers Karamazov is the most mature work of Dostoevsky. It comes out in 1880, just 1 year prior to his death. Just a little bit of physiognomy here. I don't often do this with authors, but I highly recommend that you take a look at this image of him from time to time. I think what you can see on his skull-like persona, his skull-like face with his wispy beard and his wispy top hair, is that this is somebody that is clearly meant for a hard life. Now, of course, physiognomy is not a study that is still, it is a study considered pseudo-science and not science, and yet there is something about the quality of Dostoevsky's face that I think tells many tales. And this is somebody that lived a very, very difficult life. In any case, Notes from Underground was published in 1864 in 2 installments in Dostoevsky's journal Epoch. It was a response to Nikolai G. Chernyshevsky's novel What Is to Be Done from 1963, and also his article The Anthropological Principle in Philosophy from 1860, in which he argues that there is no such thing as free will, and that enlightened man with reason and science will construct a perfect society. Well, Dostoevsky believed that man was evil, irrational, capricious, that faith beyond reason in Christ would help one master one's impulses. And so he argues against this perspective in Notes from the Underground. In one famous letter, he describes how he thirsts for faith, like parched grass, and concludes, if someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth, that in reality the truth were outside of Christ, then I should prefer to remain with Christ rather than with the truth. It's a very unmodern sentiment on his part. This is an eschewing of modern rationalism for what we might consider as superstition, giving up the truth for faith rather than the faith for truth. This work is written in 2 parts, 2 tableaux from the Underground Man's life, like Faust and Don Quixote, but there's only limited time between Dostoevsky's parts. Chronology works backwards in the notes. Part 1 is about the Underground Man as a 40-year-old man, features the 1860s, or the nihilism of the 1860s. Part 2 is about him in his 20s, and features the social romanticism popular in the 1840s. This work immediately preceded Crime and Punishment, and something to keep in mind is that this character is very much a character that embodies notions of identity because he does not have a name. He is called the Underground Man. He is not called Nikolai or Fyodor or any name that we might know as a proper name, but rather the Underground Man. So he too is a great modern character in the same way as Hamlet, who we did not have a chance to read because we read Don Quixote instead. Don Quixote, Don Juan, and I will post a link to a very good production of Don Giovanni, the Italian Don Juan, just so you can see another modern character pursuing experience and immediacy, and of course Faust. Cultural moments which claim the Underground Man, as I mentioned earlier, Nietzscheanism. He seems to have some sort of will to power, though he doesn't use it very much. Freudianism, and the Freudian idea that humans pursue 2 different principles: the Eros principle, erotic reproduction, sex. That's why so much about Freudianism is jokingly admixed with the notions of reproduction and sex. But also the other principle is the Thanatos principle, the death principle. And so sometimes I use the example of drinking as an activity that embodies both. One might drink in order to act in a more amorous, erotic manner, but in so drinking, one is poisoning oneself and thus taking oneself a little bit closer towards death. And so that's an activity that I think embodies both of those principles. Maybe it depends on how much one drinks, whether one is embodying one more than the other. I drink oneself to death. All right. Metafictionality in the Notes from Underground, we're just going to have to talk about next time because we're running out of time. And that is how things go here.